Hi, Misha here, and if you watch this channel, you know two things. One, I'm blind. Two, I like Japanese military hardware, especially World War II, but really anything. And thankfully, because of the Eagle Moss collection, I've been able to get a good sampling of Japanese naval power. But trying to find Japanese airplanes is especially difficult. Yeah, you can find Zeros, and Hobbymaster does a nice Kate, and De Agostini has done several planes now that are starting to come in a bit from Japan. But when you get to the larger Japanese planes, like the bombers, there's really nothing. So in this video, I wanted to talk about two Japanese bombers I was able to find die-cast models of. These are not in 1/72 scale, unfortunately. They are in 1/144, but beggars can't be choosers. On the left, we have the Japanese Army's Ki-21, codename Sally. This is considered a heavy bomber. It saw service in the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and was pretty much their main bomber early on in World War II. Made by Mitsubishi. And over here we have another Mitsubishi. This is the more famous, really the only real famous Japanese bomber from that war, the G4M, so-called Betty. This is the Japanese Navy's medium bomber and torpedo bomber that first flew towards the end of 1939, went into kind of pre-production in 1940, was tried out in China, and then went into full service about 6 months before Pearl Harbor. And while it was made through all of World War II and saw service through all of World War II, its heyday was the end of 1941 through the middle of 1942. So since they're both from the same factory, it's kind of interesting. The Sally over here has a slightly larger bomb capacity of about 1,000 kilograms. It's also slightly faster at about 300 miles per hour, depending on the version. The Betty, on the other hand, originally had a bomb load of about 800 kilograms. Later that would be improved. And she was slightly slower, depending on the version, between about 250 and 270 miles per hour. However, the Betty had a little bit longer range and a little bit better armament, at least in the beginning. And so yeah, it's kind of interesting to see Army versus Navy requirements for honestly a very similar role, a twin-engine long-range bomber. So yeah, the model over here is from Atlas Editions, and the Betty is from IXO, although Atlas uses much of the old IXO tooling, so they're actually quite similar. Again, needs must, and it's a decent size. I have some other 144, so it is what it is. But let's talk a little bit about their histories. These models do come with stands that are fine, but for this it just seemed easier to set them down. They come with landing gear extended only. So yeah, the Ki-21. In 1936, the Japanese Army Air Service ordered a new long-range heavy bomber to replace its outdated Ki-20s and Ki-1s, and it requested the two companies, Mitsubishi and Nakajima, develop and offer 2 prototypes each. And its requirements were pretty stiff for the mid-1930s. It needed a quite long range of 5-hour endurance or more, be able to reach at least 250 miles per hour. It needed to be able to carry at least 750 kilograms in bombs, have a crew of at least 4, be twin engine, and so on and so forth. On December 18th, the first Mitsubishi Prototype Ki-21 flew, and then at the end of the month the second prototype flew, and that would be the first one to introduce the so-called greenhouse top, kind of the long glazed housing on the top there. Nakajima would continue to do as well. They had the Ki-19. The two were pitted against each other in 1937. It was found that the Mitsubishi had better performance, but the Nakajima was more reliable and was a better bombing platform. So they ordered 2 more prototypes from both companies, and this time they ordered them to switch engines. Mitsubishi would use Naka's engines and vice versa. When this happened, the Ki-21 was the clear winner according to the Japanese Army, and so it was ordered into production in late 1937. And these would first start to see service in China in 1938. They would first fly alongside some Italian bombers that they had purchased, Fiat BR-20s, as kind of an interim measure. And very quickly, the new Japanese heavy bomber proved to just be a better all-around bomber than the Italian substitute. So with that, they started to phase them into service and try them out, figure out what did and didn't work. Early on in China, the 21 did well on unescorted missions, and so more squads were shipped in 1939. But they were experiencing some losses, quite heavy in some instances, because they had very limited armor and they did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. And early on they only had 4 7.7 millimeter machine guns for defense. So this led to some newer versions. For example, the 21-1B would introduce another 7.7 mil machine gun, and then the 21-1C would introduce yet another, bringing the total up to half a dozen, 6. They would also install some laminated rubber sheets in the wings to try to protect the fuel tanks, and they would eventually improve the engines. They would go to the ability to carry an auxiliary fuel tank in the rear bomb bay, and to compensate for bomb loss there, they would allow them to carry external bombs on the wings. And for all this, they had to give them larger landing gear because, well, it's a heavier aircraft. So it's evolving by 1940, and in 1941, when World War II begins in earnest, full scale, in December, the Japanese Army uses the Ki-21 to launch attacks against American bases in the Philippines and attacks the Commonwealth, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, in much the same way, as well as attacking Indochina. The aircraft is about 52.5 feet long, just under 74-foot wingspan, and certain versions could get up to just over 300 miles per hour with a maximum altitude of about 33,000 feet. Originally the crew was 5, but this expanded to 7 as they added more guns. And they tried to keep it modern. The 1C evolved into the Ki-21-2A, which had more powerful engines and some redesigned surfaces for better performance. And this would lead to the ultimate version, the Ki-21-2B, which replaced the greenhouse top in its 7.7mm machine gun with a pedal operated, so non-electric turret that had a 12.7mm machine gun, so basically 50 cal. And a few other improvements, and this is where the bomb capacity would jump up to about 1,000 kilograms. So by 1941, maybe early 42, the original -1 models were kind of second line training reserve units. The -2s were the mainline units, and they continued to do pretty okay early in the war, but very quickly, towards the middle end of 1942, Allied fighters like the P-40 and Hurricane had really started to take their toll. The lack of major armor and the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks, even with the rubber sheets to help protect the fuel, made them relatively easy targets. And with only 5 7.7mm guns and one essentially 50 cal gun for defense, they weren't exactly the most well-protected bombers in the sky. Nevertheless, like most Japanese hardware, because nothing better had really come along, they were still in frontline service, the -2s in 1943, and production would continue until September of 1944, and these were definitely still in major military service to the end of the war. In fact, as they were kind of shifted out of frontline bomber roles, they were used for other roles. For example, transport, either for cargo or passengers. Some were used for paratroopers. They could carry 9 paratroopers. There was a conversion program to take bombers and turn them into transports known as the MC-20, and there was even a dedicated passenger version built from the factory as such, known as the Ki-57. And the majority were built by Mitsubishi, but Nakajima would build a few hundred as well, with a total of around 2,060 by the end of production. Anyway, as I said, they were used for other duties, liaison, communications, mostly just transport stuff, and of course training bomber crews on other aircraft. And then after the Allies invaded Okinawa in April of 1945, there was a major commando raid carried out with Sallies, as the Allied codename was for these. While it wasn't the most successful thing in the world, in fact several aircraft crashed or crash-landed, those commandos that did make it through actually did some pretty major damage to aircraft and personnel at an airfield. They ran around with submachine guns and explosives, just being a nuisance that night. And that was kind of the last major op, frontline at least, you saw the Ki-21 used in. And of course, after the war, they were retired out and were no longer in production for obvious reasons. So, what about the Betty? The G4M, the naval Type 1 attack bomber. By the way, the Sally was the Army heavy bomber Type 97, not unsurprisingly. In 1937, the Mitsubishi G3M, codenamed Nell, naval bomber, was first put into service. And kind of looking at where it did well and where it needed work, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a requirement for a new long-range attack medium bomber, torpedo bomber. And much like with the Sally, the requirements were pretty ambitious. It needed to be over 245 miles per hour. It needed to have a ceiling of nearly 10,000 feet, a bomb load of 800 kilograms. It needed to have a pretty impressive range, loaded or unloaded, and so on and so forth. and again to be twin engine. And it took some time as war was beginning to ramp up, and so it wasn't until September of 1939 that Mitsubishi had a prototype for the G4M, and it was ready to fly in October and took its first test flight on the 23rd of that month. And while tests that year were quite positive, it did what they needed it to do, it was kind of not in favor. The Navy preferred another version known as the G6M that had heavier defensive armament. But yeah, the G6M, as you can tell since you don't know about it, didn't go anywhere. It wasn't what they'd hoped it be. It was underperforming. So the G4M, which had been briefly shelved, was brought back, dusted off, and decided to put it into production. Now, much like with Mitsubishi's A6M Zero, or Zeke, to get the range, speed, altitude, bomb carrying capability, to do everything the Navy needed, where they sacrificed was again with armor, this having even less armor than the Sally, and again not having self-sealing fuel tanks. Now that sounds really bad, but keep in mind in 1939-1940 a lot of airplanes didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. So, needs must, sacrifices were made, but the Navy was given what they ordered. This was to be a land-based, medium, long-range, high-speed, high-altitude bomber. And that's exactly what they got in 1940. The earliest real use of the G4M, later known as the Betty, his Allied codename, was in September of 1940 in China, of course. This was still kind of during the pre-production and ramp-up phase of the G4M1. They would go on bombing missions, being escorted by early production models of the A6M, kind of their sister design in some ways. And full production was up and running in early 1941, with the first production aircraft off the assembly line and delivered in April. And with that, another major bombing raid was in China. So they got some pretty early experience. So by the time war jumped off in December, these are ready to go. A flight would attack American bases, installation, and troops in the Philippines on December 8, especially Clark Field. That's pretty famous. They would also attack British and Australian forces. And quite famously, on December 10th, G4Ms, along with the older G3M, would be used as torpedo bombers to attack and eventually sink HMS Repulse, and a short time later HMS Prince of Wales. This was a devastating blow to the British especially, and it was the first time the naval vessel had been sunk exclusively by air power, at least in an open ocean, not counting the Pearl Harbor attack just a few days forward when they were at port, but out in operations. This also put the Allies in a very bad position in the Pacific because they really had no battleship assets, warship assets at this exact time. Pearl Harbor, the forces there were crippled. The Americans only had a handful of carriers. The British Force Z was flattened, essentially, giving them free rein. So they would conduct various long-range missions in early 1942, and actually on March 22nd, they would attack the city of Catherine in northern Australia, which was the furthest inland attack that continent suffered during the war. So quite an impressive feat, all things considered. This aircraft is quite a bit larger than the Ki-21. It's about 65.5 feet long, has a wingspan of a little under 82 feet. Top speed initially was about 255 to 260 miles per hour. Later versions would get up to about 270. Max altitude was a little lower than the Ki-21, around 26,000 feet, but she had longer range. Her initial bomb carrying capability was 800 kilograms. Later this would be expanded to a bit over 850. And she had more defensive armament. She had a 7.7 millimeter machine gun in the front. She had two 7.7 mils on each side, or one on each side for a total of two, in blisters. And she had a top dorsal turret with a 7.7. And most noticeably, she had a 20 millimeter cannon in the tail gun position, which is meant that coming up on a Betty from the rear was not the best thing in the world for an Allied fighter, at least early in World War II, because, well, 20 millimeter cannon. So they did improve her defensive armament, but again, relatively light armor, almost basically non-existent, and early on unprotected fuel tanks that were in the wings to give room in the fuselage for bombs. She had a crew of 7, as it happens, to operate all the guns and stuff. So yeah, the heyday for the G4M, especially the G4M1, was from late 40 through early 1942. However, as often starts to happen, around the same time with lots of Japanese hardware, the Allies begin to catch up and then surpass, and technology catches up and surpasses. Because again, this bomber was created based on specifications issued in 1937. So, yeah, that would change things. The Japanese called the G4M the Flying Cigar because of its shape, and Allied pilots very quickly at the beginning of the war gave it all kinds of nicknames like the Flying Lighter, the Flying Ronson, the Zippo, because if you were able to hit the fuel tanks and the wings, it would burst into flames. You know, funnily enough, if you didn't, it was actually a relatively durable design. It could even fly on one engine. But, yeah, the lack of armor was well known, and the fact you didn't want to approach it from the rear was well known. So they developed tactics, as often happens. And the first major sign that things were just really going against it came during the Solomon Islands campaign during Guadalcanal on August 8th, when 23 were sent to torpedo bomb American warships, much as they had done with Repulse and Prince of Wales, but the outcome was very different. Of those nearly 24 bombers, 18 were shot down, and they scored no major victories against Allied ships. Now, they were used on other shipping successfully during that campaign, and also against some land targets, so it wasn't completely one-sided. But during about 3 months, the campaign was about half a year total, but mostly between August and October, they lost over 100 G4Ms. And of course, each time they lost one, they lost 7 crew, so they lost 700 trained crewmen, including pilots, some veterans of the Chinese campaigns. And this is really when the design started to be dated. This would be still the G4M1. Now, they had just previously, beginning in March of 42 and making it a standard feature by August, given it better performing engines, mostly targeted at better performance at higher altitudes. This helped. Also, in March of 43, after the Guadalcanal, they added some extra armor, especially for the little tail gunner in the back. And they added rubber laminate sheets on the underside of the wings to try to protect the fuel tanks. This was good for defense, but it did cost them nearly 10 miles per hour and nearly 200 miles of range. Now, they had already been working on a replacement for the M1, known as the M2. The first prototype flew in December of 42, and it went into mass production in mid-43. It had new engines, higher performance. They also went from a 3-blade to a 4-blade propeller. And they would improve a few other little things. They would go to a new tail cone for the rear gunner, which actually was tried out on late production M1s, but was standard on the M2. And they would replace the top 7.7 millimeter turret with an electric 20 millimeter turret, meaning now they would have two 20 millimeter cannons and four 7.7 30 cal basically machine guns for defense. They would also improve the bomb carrying ability a little bit. They would revise the wings and the tail horizontals, so the M2 could fly faster and higher. They would also add additional fuel tankage for increased range again, and they would add more bits of armor here and there. That was the standard production model by the end of 43, and once it was proven to be successful, they took the M1, this version here, out of production at the beginning of 1944. And then in 1944, the next version was tried out, the G4M3. This would have self-sealing fuel tanks for the first time, as well as many other revisions and updates, and yet even a heavier bomb payload capacity, but it was only still about 860 kilograms even at the end. They would also, with various versions, substitute some of the 7.7 guns for 13 millimeter machine guns, so on and so forth, even more 20 millimeter cannons on some, all kinds of different updates, and they would keep adding armor when and where they could. But the M3 only went into production around September of 1944, at least full-scale production, so it was actually produced in relatively small numbers, although production would continue for the Betty, Allied codename, up until the end of the war. And they would produce just under 2,500 total, so significantly more than the Ki-21. Probably the most famous event involving a G4M Betty was on April 18, 1943, when Admiral of the Fleet Yamamoto was taking one of these as his personal transport in a flight of, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 of them, but anyway, a flight of Bettys. When the Allied intelligence got wind of this and sent 16 P-38 Lightnings, one of their longest range fighters at the time, they intercepted, they shot down his bomber, killing him. They also shot down another that crash landed, but this killed Yamamoto, which obviously was not good for the Japanese Navy's future prospects. They, of course, would continue to use these, including the improved versions, throughout all of the fun times. As America would invade, they would use these for counterattack, they would use these for defense, they would use these to attack the Americans as they occupied Okinawa in April of 1945. In fact, this was still the primary bomber of the Navy and really all of Japan in the summer of 1945. It was the best thing they had. And they never really got to retire out all the old M1s because they made so many and because they just never had enough M3s and even M2s to speak of, even though they were definitely improvements. And kind of as a final note in this aircraft's career, after the Japanese surrender for negotiation talks, 2 specially painted G4Ms flew the Japanese delegation to meet with the Allies to discuss terms of the surrender. So at the end of their career, they had a peaceful, I guess, purpose, you would say. But yeah, that was the Japanese Navy's premier bomber in World War II. A replacement was designed, but it never really did anything. It only went into production in the very last stages of the war, so they made very few. That's a common repeated thing. Japan knew their planes were getting outdated. If you look at their planes, they always had a replacement on the drawing board, but for various reasons they never went into full production or even production at all, like the A7M. So they weren't ignorant, but they were stuck in a position. And they knew if they didn't win the war by, say, the end of 1942, they really couldn't. I mean, America had 10 times the industrial capacity, and their homeland was safe. Japan never had a serious way of threatening. I mean, a plane that carries 800 kilograms or even 1,000 kilograms of bombs, no matter how long its range might be, is not going to threaten a country the size of America. But that wasn't really the point. So, what about these models here, this IXO and the Atlas? These are inexpensive models, so, expectations have to be curbed. They're $20, $25. They both have landing gear down. The IXO does have moving propellers, which is kind of nice. The Atlas does not, which is a little odd considering it's basically built on the same tooling, but, it is what it is. They both have a little bit of glass glazing simulation. They both have rear guns. Of course, the guns don't move because how could they, as small as they are? The Ki-21 is pretty heavy. It's actually virtually all metal, which is nice, except for the small details, of course. Things like the propellers, the wheels, the guns. But the wings, the fuselage, even some of the tail is metal. The G4M is much lighter, even though it's bigger, and at first that kind of disappointed me. I was kind of a little bummed out, because the metal is essentially the body. But then I got to thinking, as thin as the wings are on these, you really couldn't make them out of metal and be to scale. And as light as this aircraft was in reality, it's kind of neat that the model itself is relatively light. It really conveys that fast but fragile. The plastic doesn't feel fragile, it's just light compared to how big it is. So it's kind of a neat thing. It also has a neat texture to it. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please post them. And maybe check out some of my other videos. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.